Well, hello, good evening, and welcome to episode 36 of Humanity versus Insanity, the Crane Report. Well, it is just 58 days now until the UK goes to the polls, and we have what is perhaps going to be one of the most interesting general elections in a very long time. It's also going to be interesting to see how the establishment attempts to manipulate the outcome in the coming weeks, because although vote rigging is not beyond their capability, it has certainly been known, not least in Tony Blair's Sedgefield constituency in 2005, when despite him being at the height of his unpopularity, he managed to achieve a larger majority than he had achieved in the previous election. So the preference being not to have to resort to those tactics, manage the outcome through the media. So in those 58 days, I've got a pretty busy schedule ahead of me, not least because in 2 days I'm going to kick off my Apathy Kills tour. Full title being Apathy Kills, the greatest threat to humanity ever. Well, things certainly are getting interesting, because not just in the UK, in fact, one might argue that the UK is actually a little bit behind some of the other countries, not least, of course, Greece and Spain, and certainly Iceland. But we're catching up fast. But maybe we don't need to catch up too fast. Everything has its time. So over the next 6 weeks, I'm going to be presenting Apathy Kills in 23 cities around the country. I will be visiting Scotland and Wales and indeed Northern Ireland. I'll be leaving out Southern Ireland on this occasion because my focus is very much about the forthcoming election and what I anticipate being the aftermath. But it's not just about looking at the election, it's also about building on the grassroots movements that are growing right around the world, and not least in the UK. And one of the biggest of those, one of the most fast developing movements is, of course, the anti-fracking community. So I kick off in Liverpool on Wednesday, and then move to Manchester on Thursday, and then back south to Reading, just on the M4, on Friday, before heading off to Belfast on Tuesday, and then back into the UK for Milton Keynes on the Friday. And for full details of the tour, you can go to my website, which is ianrcrane.com. Then I take a short break, well, a weekend break anyway, from the tour, because on the 21st of March, on the Saturday, I should be attending the world premiere of the documentary, which is centered around much of the footage that I took when I was in Australia last November and December. The film is called Voices from the Gas Fields. It started with just one well. And the editing is being done by my good friend Marco Jackson, who is the powerhouse behind the Truth Behind the Dash for Gas, which was released some 2 years ago. We've pushed to get this documentary out so that we have 6 weeks in the run-up before the general election, because there is little doubt, of course, that the main parties are pushing to establish an unconventional gas agenda in the UK. Well, I'm not going to spend too much time on that on this show, because I'll be addressing that in a little while on Fracking Nightmare. But if you happen to be in anywhere near the northeast, then do come along to Beverley. It's just a few miles off the M62. It's a very large venue, has seating for some 400 plus, and join us for the premiere of Voices from the Gas Fields. Now, this is somewhat of a lower budget production than Frackman, but Frackman's own publicity information states that it has been 5 years in the making, and in that 5 years, some 7,000 wells have been drilled in southern Queensland. This film has been 3 months in the making, But nonetheless, I've seen the work of Marco. It's truly masterful, and I know from what I've seen already, it's going to be a very, very powerful presentation. Not least, of course, it's going to ram home the fact that the unconventional gas industry is determined to destroy large chunks of the planet, and that if this industry did come to the UK, then the country within a few years would be unrecognisable. Not to mention the trail of devastation that it would leave behind. Now, after the election, in fact, not even 10 days after the election, we have AV6. And for those who attended AV5, you will remember that we had some interesting events there. But I am pleased to announce that Greg Nicoletus will be joining us at AV6. He's actually being chaperoned across to the UK, just in case he happens to meet any more strange men along the way. But he'll be bringing his wife and family with him, and he will be not only presenting what he had intended to present last year, but such a massive update that he's basically said that once he's made this presentation, that's pretty much it, because he's forecasting what is going to be happening with the transhumanist agenda. And from what I've seen of Greg, then there's no question that this is certainly going to be a presentation to be remembered. So AV6, the tickets are available on alternativeview.co.uk. It is a residential event. There's 3 nights full board at the wonderful Staverton Park Hotel. If you know of anybody who came along to AV5, then you can certainly get a report on the event from them. Now, this evening, I'm going to give you a little bit of an insight into some of the subjects that we're going to be addressing on the Apathy Kills tour. We're going to be trying to ensure that people understand the magnitude of the differential between the diatribe that is being presented in the mainstream media over the recovering economy and people being better off than they were before the global financial collapse, and the reality. Well, however we present it, it is going to be absolutely shocking. And I'm going to use some updated video, short video, and some of that I'm going to share with you tonight. But let's first maybe take a look at the magnitude of the differential in the global wealth distribution and the difference between what people think it should be, what people think it is, and the disturbing reality. Take a look at this.
how things were.
Not to the end of every enemy of the state!
And then I woke up here.
They are the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom, are becoming increasingly desperate. As Zbigniew Brzezinski stated a few years ago, it's far easier to kill 1 million people than it is to control them. He also stated that the biggest obstacle to establishing the one world government is the rapid political and spiritual awakening of the masses. As the ruling elite, as they refer to themselves, accumulate an increasing amount of the global wealth and establish the physical and material control, they don't understand why it is that the masses have somewhat different ideas about how life should be lived on this mortal coil. Fortunately, an increasing number of people are waking up to the reality, and the producer of that particular film, Grey State, is a guy by the name of David Crowley. Well, David Crowley was certainly well aware of the underlying agenda and the ultimate goal of the ruling elite, and was determined to share his insights with the masses. But did he get perhaps a little bit too close to the truth? Because sadly, David Crowley, just a few months ago, is alleged to have murdered his family and then committed suicide. So this is a high-risk game, and those who make the effort to share the truth perhaps know that they are on the mark when the establishment finds a way to eliminate them. And what we have to do is to make sure that their work does get out and is widely distributed across an increasing number of the population. One of the things that Crowley was very aware of was the way in which the ruling elite are literally printing the money to line their own pockets with, so that they have an increasing share of the global wealth, whilst ensuring that those at the lower end of society have less and less. Let's take a look at a short animation, and let's have a look at the reality in terms of the distribution of monetary wealth.
So I did some research, and this is what I found from reliable sources like the UN. It turns out that while the US is totally out of whack, things are actually way worse for the planet as a whole. Let's start with this graph. A perfectly even distribution of wealth among all living people, with everyone divided into 5 equal groups. Now, let's show how much each group actually has. Shocking, right? 80% of the world's people barely have any wealth. It's hard to even see them on the charts. Meanwhile, the richest 2%, they have more wealth than half of the rest of the world. Let's look at this chart another way. Let's take the whole world's population, all 7 billion of us, and reduce it to just a representative 100 individuals. Here they are, poorest people on the left, richest people on the right. Now let's show how the world's total wealth, roughly $223 trillion, is distributed. The vast majority have practically nothing. Nothing with which to educate their children, nothing with which to pay for basic medicines. While the richest 1%, they've accumulated 43% of our world's wealth. The bottom 80%, meanwhile, that's 8 out of every 10 people, have just 6% between them. But even this doesn't really show how extreme things have become. The richest 300 people on Earth have the same wealth as the poorest 3 billion. So the number of people it takes to fill a mid-sized commercial aircraft have more wealth than the populations of India, China, the US and Brazil combined. We can also see this difference geographically, with a huge and growing gap between a few rich places versus the majority of the world. For most of history, things were much more equal. 200 years ago, rich countries were only 3 times richer than poor countries. By the end of colonialism in the 1960s, they were 35 times richer. Today, they're about 80 times richer. Rich countries try to compensate for this by giving aid to poor countries, about $130 billion each year. That's a lot of money. So then why does the wealth gap keep getting bigger? One reason I found is that large corporations are taking more than $900 billion out of poor countries each year through a form of tax avoidance called trade mispricing. On top of this, each year poor countries are paying about $600 billion in debt service to rich countries on loans that have already been paid off many times over. And then there's the money that poor countries lose from trade rules imposed by rich countries to get access to more resources and cheaper labor. Economists from the University of Massachusetts calculate that this costs poor countries about $500 billion a year. Altogether, that's more than $2 trillion that flows from some of the poorest parts of the world to the richest. Every year. Rich governments like to say they're helping poor countries develop. But who's developing who here? This makes me think that there's something wrong with the basic rules of the global economy. It can't be okay that the wealth of our planet is becoming so concentrated in the hands of such a tiny number of people. The only reasonable response, it seems to me, and our only hope, is to change the rules.
I haven't yet come across anybody who comes even close to comprehending the magnitude of the obscenity in terms of the amount of global wealth that is in such few hands. Of course, the mythology that's presented to the masses is that those that have wealth are philanthropic and they are doing everything they can to share their gains and their wealth with those who don't have as much. But what they're sharing is literally chump change. It's the loose change out of their pockets. It has nothing to do with sharing wealth. It's all about accumulation. This graphic that you see on screen here that appeared in Brick Lane some 3 years ago now, and it absolutely epitomizes what is occurring. The ruling elite playing the game of global monopoly on the backs of the masses. But the video that you've just seen, the animation, that was the global basis. Surely the UK is nothing like so extreme. Take a look at this.
In Britain, we take pride from living in a fair country. We believe that everyone should be given a chance in life to prosper through skill and hard work, whether as a care worker, shop assistant, soldier, civil servant, or company boss. However, is Britain as fair as it seems to be? How is wealth distributed in Britain today? Imagine the total wealth of the UK is £100. Now, imagine these people represent the population of the country. A new ICM poll asked 2,000 British people how this wealth should be distributed, from those with less wealth to those with more. As you can see, we think it's right that some people have more wealth than others. In a really fair Britain, we say, the richest fifth would have 25 of these coins. That's 25% of all the wealth, while the poorest fifth would have around 15. Even in our ideal world, some people will always have more than others, but we know we don't live in an ideal world. So next, the poll asked what we think is the actual distribution of wealth. As you can see, the results are quite different. We think that in Britain, the poorest fifth now has about 9% of the wealth, while the richest has more than 40%. That's £40 out of every 100. Doesn't seem very fair until you see what the real situation is. Not what we think it is, or how we think it should be, but how it really is. We can now see that Britain is not such a fair country after all. The fact is that the richest 20% have 60% of all the wealth. That's almost twice as much as everyone else put together, and 100 times more than the bottom 20% have. And the richest 1%? Well, they're off the scale. In fact, they have as much wealth as 60% of the population of the UK combined. As for the poorest fifth, if £100 were the total wealth, they would not even have a whole pound. Next to the richest fifth's £60, they would only have 60 pence. That's small change. This is the result of over 30 years of growing inequality. If this trend continues, it will be even harder to call Britain a fair country. Learn more at www.inequalitybriefing.org.
And welcome back. So that illustrates the fact that the UK is no better than the rest of the world. Those who perceive themselves to be the rightful rulers of probably not just the UK, but much of the world, many of whom reside within the confines of the City of London. Meanwhile, of course, David Cameron and George Osborne pump out the myth that they have the economy back under control, that people are better off. But in the same breath, they also talk about the need for austerity. And those people at the lower end of the social strata, those people who are reliant on benefits, not because they necessarily want to be reliant on benefits, but because there isn't the opportunity for them to get out there and earn a meaningful wage. The level of debt is increasing exponentially. Right now, the UK debt sits at around about 95% of GDP. And once it gets above 100% of GDP, that's the point at which the banksters effectively own the country. And some of you may have seen that recently there have been in the national press items about areas of outstanding natural beauty being sold off in a bid to raise finance. And that finance is simply to pay the interest on this spiralling national debt. Meanwhile, David Cameron also claims that people are starting to get back on their feet. That the low level of interest rates, which of course is certainly impacting on people who have accumulated some funds because they're not getting any interest returns or very low interest returns on it. But those people at the bottom end, let's just take a look for a second at the increasing gap in earnings between those who sit in the boardroom and those on the 0 hours contracts at the other end of the spectrum.
Everywhere, people are paid differently for their work. What we are paid rewards skill, training, and experience, as well as the types of work we do. But how big should those differences be between those at the top and the rest of us? And are very large pay gaps good for society and our economy? Let's focus on two people. Brenda is an experienced nurse in one of Britain's busiest hospitals. After several years moving up her pay scale, she earns £12 an hour, the average wage in the UK. Brian is the boss of one of Britain's biggest companies. He earns £1,200 an hour. That's 100 times more than Brenda earns. In fact, that means Brian makes as much in just 3 days as Brenda earns in a whole year. Brenda struggles to get by on what she gets paid. Wages for average earners like Brenda have hardly changed in a decade, whilst food prices are going up, gas and electricity bills are rising, and rents are going through the roof. Brian, on the other hand, has seen his annual pay increase by £2 million over the same decade. That means he now earns 4 times as much in 1 year as Brenda will in her entire life. Doesn't seem very fair, does it? The fact is, for the first time, most people in poverty in the UK are actually in work. Growing numbers of working people struggle to pay the bills and now resort to food banks just to survive. And as people on average incomes are increasingly squeezed, less money is spent in our high streets. The growing pay gap between pay at the top and pay for everyone else is bad for those who earn the least, bad for average workers like Brenda, and bad for Britain's economy. And all the while, people like Brian do better and better. But it doesn't have to be like this. Other modern, successful European countries have prosperous societies with all the new technology and consumer goods that we enjoy in the UK. But in those countries, incomes are divided much more evenly. The super rich have a bit less than they do in the UK, but everyone else has a little more. If the total income of everyone in the UK was shared between the richest 1% and everyone else in the same way as it is in the Netherlands or Denmark, for example, 99% of us would be better off by nearly £3,000 a year per household. So, if we want to tackle poverty, we have to do something about inequality. Because higher incomes for some means lower incomes for others. Most people don't get their fair share because some are taking far more than their fair share. This is why it is essential for Britain to cut the growing pay gap between those at the very top and the rest of us. Learn more at highpaycentre.org and inequalitybriefing.org.
So in the UK, we have an economy that has at the heart of its philosophy the Gordon Gekko mantra of greed is good. Everything about the UK economy is about I, myself, and me. It's about accumulation of obscene wealth, regardless of the fact that there are many people at the other end of the spectrum who can barely afford to put food on their table. And we're seeing benefits being cut. Atos, the full title was Don't Give Atos, been replaced now by Maximus. But once again, the people that are tasked with managing the benefits in this country are effectively instructed to make life as difficult as possible for those who sit across the table in front of them. Sanction them at any moment for any cause and make them struggle, and then accuse them of fraud because you cannot begin to think or imagine how they could actually live on such a minuscule amount of funds. Even having a situation where people are being suggested that they go out and prostitute themselves to make money. Following the lead of Germany, of course, where prostitution is a proper recognised profession. And in Germany, people who are out of work, if they don't take an interest in the prostitution opportunities, then their benefits are cut. Well, we haven't quite perhaps got to that stage in the UK yet, but we're not far off. Speaking as somebody who has never claimed benefits and will do pretty much anything to avoid claiming benefits, I will not be dependent on the criminal state. But I absolutely understand that the benefit system is essential. And there will, of course, always be people who try to abuse the system, but they are the minority. The vast majority of people are on benefits purely out of necessity. And we're increasingly reading in the media of people that are committing suicide because they're having their benefits cut, they're facing eviction, they can't put food on the table for their family. And what kind of society is it that evicts the terminally ill or the long-term sick and throws them out on the street. This is no society that I want to be part of. Yet, the establishment, those who anoint themselves as the political leaders of this country, seem determined to perpetuate this philosophy of those who have need to have more, and those who don't have, well, they don't deserve anything. Right across the world now, we are seeing movements spring up, particularly in Greece and in Spain with Syriza and the Podemos. Well, I had great hopes for Greece. Once Syriza effectively came into power, I certainly hoped that they were going to extricate themselves from the euro. They were going to tell the bankers to go take a hike, and they might even establish or re-establish the drachma and print a currency of the people. But what happened? What happened? Were the leaders taken down into the basement and, as Bill Hicks used to observe, shown the real footage of what happened at Dealey Plaza when JFK was assassinated in 1963? Because all of a sudden it seems that all Syriza are doing are kicking the can down the road and have effectively delayed the repayments by a further 4 months. So what are they doing here? They're effectively perpetuating austerity. Those who perceive themselves to be the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom believe that by controlling the financial alchemy, they can take total control of the board. What is an essential part of their philosophy, though, is that the masses do not become aware of the way in which the financial system is literally manipulated out of thin air. Well, the good news is that more and more people are understanding the fundamentals of fractional reserve banking and are seeing it for the fraud that it truly is. Until such time as any political party is prepared to bring about the changes in the financial system, then unfortunately it's just noise. So whatever happens on May the 7th of this year in the UK general elections, sadly, without a fundamental change in the financial system, it's just going to be more of the same. It's not going to matter one iota whether it's a right-wing coalition of the Tories and UKIP, whether it's a left-wing coalition of Labour and SNP, or even a left-wing coalition which nudges Labour out of the way. And it's a coalition between Plaid Cymru, the SNP, and perhaps the Northern Irish members. Now, that's going to be an interesting turn-up for the books, isn't it? But the reality is nothing will change until such time as the financial system is amended dramatically. Meanwhile, of course, the vast majority are simply being encouraged to get a job, go to work, get married, have children, follow fashion, have the latest must-have accessory, act normal, walk on the pavement, watch TV, obey the law, and save for your old age. Well, if you believe any of that crud, then God help you. Because if you think you're free, then you are not. They say that the pen is mightier than the sword. It surely is, because you're absolutely in slavery. Well, 4 years ago, nearly 4 years ago, I was invited to participate in an event in London hosted by the British Humanist Society. And one of the speakers there was a doctor who is based or was based at Canterbury University, Dr. Karen Douglas. And she, along with Christopher French and the Demos twins, Jamie Bartlett and Carl Miller, presented the orthodox view of those who challenge the status quo and trot out the term conspiracy theorist. Well, Dr. Karen Douglas was an interesting presenter that day because she opened her presentation by actually saying that she wasn't interested in the truth. She was simply interested in finding out why it was that there were an increasing number of people who elected to challenge the orthodox view put out by the mainstream media. Well, I did suggest during my presentation that Karen Douglas's research was somewhat shallow. Well, full respect to her, she maybe took that on board, although she didn't actually speak to me after the event, because she did publish a report in 2013 which got some attention. And here was from one online blog. It said, does the latest research from Karen Douglas show that conspiracy theorists are the sane ones? The article continued, recent studies by psychologists and social scientists in the UK and the US suggest that contrary to mainstream media stereotypes, those labelled as conspiracy theorists appear to be saner than those who accept the official versions of contested events. And in another article on the same subject, it said recent studies by psychologists now suggest that contrary to mainstream media stereotypes, those labelled conspiracy theorists appear to be saner than those who accept official versions of events. The most recent study was published by psychologists Michael J. Wood and Karen Douglas at the University of Kent, with a study entitled What About Building 7? A social psychological study of online discussion of 9/11 conspiracy theories. The study compared conspiracist, pro-conspiracy theory, and conventionalist, anti-conspiracy comments at news websites. The summary was, in short, the new study by Wood and Douglas suggests that the negative stereotype of the conspiracy theorist, a hostile fanatic wedded to the truth of his own fringe theory, accurately describes the people who defend the official account of 9/11, not those who dispute it. Well, of course, this is what many of us have known for years. Those whose belief systems are based on what they read in the mainstream media are indeed shallow. They have no contextual understanding of global events, whereas those who do scratch beneath the surface certainly would appear to not only be able to articulate their understanding of the evolving scenario with a much greater degree of clarity than those who simply dig their heels in and trot out the same diatribe as their political leaders. Well, there was an event, unfortunately I missed it last year, but I'm going to look out for it now because I think it's time that I probably went and had another chat with Karen Douglas, because she certainly seems to be coming around to the view that actually the saner elements are those who challenge orthodoxy. Well, Carl Miller and Jamie Bartlett are probably reaching for the Valium. They're ripping their hair out as they realise that they are fighting a rearguard action, and the increasing number of people who are actually starting to go, hang on a second, is growing exponentially. Well, for those of you who want to bring yourself up to speed, if you're coming at this as a relative newcomer, then look no further than this documentary. Now, it is an opus magnum. It runs to about 3.5 hours, but you don't necessarily have to watch it all in one hit. In fact, probably better to watch it in half-hour chunks and then go do a bit of research and check out, because I'm sure that, like the rest of us, the producers of this documentary do not expect you to take everything that they present at face value. They want you to dig deeper, understand the context, and be able to articulate your views. So the documentary is on YouTube. It's called JFK to 9/11. Everything is a rich man's trick, i.e. those who think they are the rightful rulers of a planetary fiefdom. Well, it's often said that, what can we do? What can one person do? Well, one of the speakers at AV6 will be Pippa King. And Pippa King has been a lone campaigner in the UK for the past 9 years, challenging the biometrics RFID and surveillance systems that are unfolding in the UK at a phenomenal rate of knots. And Pippa is a very, very powerful speaker. And if you haven't come across her before, she has been a guest on a previous edition of Humanity versus Insanity. But the reason that I have so much respect for her is because despite the fact that she was pretty much alone in her quest, she has never given up, and she is the epitome of what one person can achieve. Fortunately, she's now becoming part of an increasing community, but nonetheless, the agenda to lure people into the barcode is increasing at a phenomenal rate. Meanwhile, of course, in the UK, we have recently had the HSBC scandal, where it has been revealed that HSBC has been working with those who think they're the rightful rulers to evade taxes, because taxes are, of course, only for the little people. Well, it does seem that an increasing number of people are now saying, you know what, we're not going to pay any taxes. We're not going to pay any taxes to a government that clearly is criminal, that clearly is using taxes to finance illegal wars, and is doing absolutely nothing to bring the banksters to justice. Indeed, as we now know, some of those banksters who have been manipulating the tax affairs of those who think they're the rightful rulers are being given senior positions in government. It would seem that they need to share that expertise. Well, once again, at AV6, we're going to be bringing some people into the event who can help the little people use the same tools that those who think they're the rightful rulers are using. You know, we're coming to the point where everybody has a choice. And the next 5 years are going to be critical. If we continue down the current paradigm, then I doubt very much whether I and many others will effectively be at liberty by the time of the 2020 election. The rate at which we are being surveilled, the recent decision by the High Court to give the Metropolitan Police the authority to maintain a database on anyone who has the audacity to challenge orthodoxy, means that the police state is accelerating at a phenomenal rate. We either start the process of bringing about the change now, or we descend into a totalitarian corporatist hell. So, to paraphrase the words of that intellectual giant, George W. Bush, you're either with us or you are with the socio-psychopathic global corporatists. Well, if you have the opportunity to join me on any one of my forthcoming Apathy Kills events, then we're going to be talking about the ways in which grassroots community groups or individuals can bring about the changes that we all know that we need to see. Thank you for joining me tonight. Join me in 45 minutes on Fracking Nightmare.